biological psychology. In this first section, we're going to look at the divisions of the nervous system. Specifically, we need to look at the central and peripheral nervous system, and the somatic and autonomic nervous system. Let's start with the big picture. This will help you understand the context of the different bits that make up the module. The nervous system is the electrical communication system within the body that controls voluntary and involuntary actions, i.e., those we have conscious control over and those we don't, like heartbeat. The focus on electrical here is an important one because later we'll be looking at chemical communication systems within the body when we look at the endocrine system. There are lots of different ways to think about dividing up the nervous system. These are usually based on location or function, that is, where stuff is and what it does. Structurally, the first division we need to consider is between the central and peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made up of the brain and the spinal cord. The peripheral nervous system is anything outside of the spinal cord, carrying information to or from organs, muscles, glands, etc. The peripheral nervous system then can be divided further up into somatic and autonomic nervous systems. So considering the central nervous system, let's look in more detail at the brain. Structurally and functionally, we tend to split the brain up into three sections: the hindbrain, the midbrain, and the forebrain. These areas develop in sequence, and also evolutionarily, the hindbrain is older than the forebrain, and this will make sense when we consider their functions. The hindbrain, evolutionarily the oldest, includes major structures like the medulla, the pons, and the cerebellum. The medulla, or medulla oblongata, is the top of the spinal cord, but not within the spine itself. It represents the structural and functional division between the two and handles most of our basic life support functions. For example, cardiac functions, those concerning the heart and its activities, respiratory functions, referring to breathing and the actions of the lung and diaphragm, and vasomotor, that's the control of the diameter of blood vessels. Let's think why that might be important. Why would we need to control the diameter of blood vessels? Well, by altering the diameter of blood vessels, we control blood pressure, and that will influence the flow of oxygen and fuel to cells, and this will be important when we look at things like the stress response. Running through the medulla is the reticular activating system, or RAS. This is like your brain's broadband of information to and from the brain. The ascending, or ARAS, carries information to the brain, and the descending, or DRAS, carries instructions from the brain to the rest of the body. Now, the reticular activating system is going to be important later on when you look at biological rhythms like sleep. The pons, meaning bridge, has an important role in sensory and motor functions. For example, in terms of sensory, it's important for hearing, balance, taste, and facial sensation. And for motor, for things like eye movement, facial expressions, chewing and swallowing. Again, as you'll see later, it's also very important with things like sleep mechanisms. The cerebellum, or little brain, looks like a separate structure at the back of the brain and is critical in coordination of movement, precision and timing. It's also now thought to be involved in cognitive processes such as attention, language, and the regulation of fear and pleasure responses. The midbrain, or mesencephalon, is essentially the bit that joins the forebrain to the hindbrain. It's concerned with functions of hearing, motor control, sleep-wake arousal, and temperature regulation. The forebrain contains many of the important structures that we will come across in other bits of the course. For example, the thalamus is essentially a relay station for all the information going to the cortex for processing and all the instructions going to the rest of the brain and the body from the cortex. The hypothalamus, literally meaning underneath the thalamus, is central to everything we do. It is critical in linking neural and hormonal activity in the body, That's electrical and chemical activity in the body, both in its own right and through its interaction with the pituitary gland. Its major functions can be thought of as fight, flight, feeding, and reproductive behaviour. The pituitary gland is below and anterior, that means in front of, the hypothalamus, and attached by the pituitary stalk. It's sometimes called the master gland and is critical for hormonal activity in the body and functions such as growth, blood pressure, kidney regulation, reproductive behaviour, temperature, and pain regulation. You'll look at this in much more detail in a later lesson. The cerebral cortex refers to the convoluted, that's folded, surface layer of the two cerebral hemispheres, which are divided into lobes. The reason for the folds, the convolutions, is that this increases the surface area of cortex that we're able to get inside our skull. The cerebral cortex is responsible for the highest of cognitive functioning, including things like planning, problem solving, language, consciousness, perception, and movement. You may have noticed already in what we've said that many functions and locations seem to overlap in terms of responsibility. This is because it is more appropriate to think of the brain as a collection of functional pathways rather than functional locations, and a pathway could go through many areas of the brain. The peripheral nervous system. Think of peripheral as meaning on the edge. This consists of the 31 pairs of spinal nerves that go from the spinal cord out to the rest of the body. Its main function is to connect the central nervous system to the muscles and organs. Remember, an organ is a self-contained part of the body which performs a specific function. Question: which is your biggest organ? Your skin, of course. Did you get it right? Let's look at the divisions of the peripheral nervous system. Firstly, the somatic nervous system. This is associated with voluntary control of skeletal muscle and consists of afferent and efferent nerves. Afferent nerves carry sensory information towards the central nervous system. Efferent nerves carry motor or instructional information to the muscles and organs and glands and away from the central nervous system. The autonomic nervous system is responsible for the control and regulation of internal organs and the management of our internal environment through things like homeostasis and the response to demands like fight or flight. The autonomic nervous system is ultimately regulated by the hypothalamus. So, we've divided the peripheral nervous system up into somatic and autonomic, but there's one last division we need to look at, and that is that we can divide the autonomic nervous system up again into sympathetic and parasympathetic nerves. The sympathetic nervous system is concerned with activities that demand an increase in energy usage, for example, fight or flight responses. So, sympathetic nerves would lead to things like an increase in heart rate, blood pressure and respiration, flow of blood to skeletal muscles and away from the visceral muscle, which means your guts, your intestines, and things like pupillary dilation. The parasympathetic nervous system concerns activities that act to store and save energy. Think of it as rest and digest. So, activities that involve digestion, such as the production of saliva, but also things like sexual arousal are parasympathetic activities, and pupillary dilation. Now hang on, we said that that was a sympathetic activity. This is a really useful illustration that while the two branches might be thought of as opposites, that's wrong. They're not opposites, they are better thought of as complementary, and actually we have the same behaviour being controlled by two different branches of the nervous system, but for different reasons. So, if you find yourself staring into somebody's eyes, wondering if they fancy you, because you're looking for pupillary dilation, just remember, They might actually just be frightened of you.